Hello, Strategist here, my lovely little students, and this week's entry into the College of Dwarfology is going to be slightly weird in that I'm going to need to use a lot of MS Paint. I'm not a great artist, but I believe, since it's mostly just squares, that I have done it in such a way as to at least be informative. This week, we are going to be transitioning. Last week we covered water physics, and a lot of people have been asking me about minecart physics. How do minecarts work? Particularly impulse ramps, things like that. And what we're getting into at this point is a lot of how to abuse the Z-layer system. So this week we're going to be discussing kind of behind the scenes how the Z-layer system works. Not necessarily how it's actually programmed, but for us as players, what helps us understand what's going on, if that makes sense. Just a good idea for having a working knowledge base to go on. So, what is a Z-layer? X is left and right, or I should say, we know Dwarf Fortress is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional world. So how do you do this? Just a quick thing, we know left and right is X, up and down is Y, and then if you go up and down in elevation in the world, that is a Z layer. I don't know why I'm doing air quotes. I'm not a high schooler. It is a Z layer. We can determine what our Z layer is. This is 142, this is 141, this is 143. It is what slice in terms of elevation are you currently looking at? But what does that physically actually mean for what the game is doing? What is contained within a slice? What is, in essence, a Z-layer actually? It's like, what is time? What is this thing we interact with, and what does it mean? So, the best representation that I can come up to think of, and this actually kind of reflects what you'll see in programs in Armok Vision, oddly enough, is every Z layer can be broken down into 3 squares and the layer divisor, the actual, where the camera is. We'll call it the camera space. Like hammer space, the camera space between Z layers. So this is the bottom square, middle square, top square, and then these long rectangles, even though I've added some width to them so I can show something later, that is infinitesimally small. That is where the camera goes as you go up and down Z layers. Because right now, we know that there's a ground there, so how are we seeing this? The camera is physically in that Z layer, even if it's below ground. That's how you're able to see it. That is the camera space. Now, there are different rendering programs within Dwarf Fortress. Text will be text, 2D, classic, or whatever it's called, standard, so on and so forth. And some of them have different ways they handle things. In particular, possibly you might need DF-Hack to be able to pull it off. I forget what actually gives you the option to see multiple Z layers. But if you get Lazy New Pack and you scroll up and down, you'll be able to see lower Z layers. But in other rendering modes, you can't. Just to explain that, all that really is these camera spaces are transparent if you have the right rendering mode. If you don't, they're opaque. That's really what it is. The gray fog of war is just extremely transparent. As we go up, you see how it gets harder and harder to see what's down there. That's just because in this one, the transparency of the camera space, stop doing air quotes, the transparency of the camera space that we're going to use for this description is much higher than it is in other ones. Just to address that part of this right here, that still works. Now, if you're walking around, you are walking around, your X and your Y are through this, and when you do up and down in Z layers, you're literally just taking the camera and you're moving it down to the next camera line. That's what moving up and down a Z layer is. You are just moving which one of these red rectangles the camera is in. But what happens when you need to interact? When the game calculates things between Z layers, what is happening? Well, what is happening is we are breaching that camera space, and breaching the camera space is where a lot of the physics gets weird. I'm not going to go in depth in the water physics. We addressed it in last week's video. I will, at the end of this, have a bit of water just so we can explain how one of the calculations happened. But basically, whenever you're needing to calculate things through Z layers, you have to understand that a lot of times what you're doing is you're just interacting with a camera space, and that's kind of why the physics doesn't make sense. Now, we have stair systems and we have ramps. This goes between Z layers, but if I do a stair system over here and I just do a down stair, this man comes over and digs it. All right, we got a down stair. I can see below it. Oh, I dug into this. I can see below it, but I can't interact with it. That kind of didn't help me. I'm gonna do one slightly further up. We're just gonna call that a do it live blooper. If you go down below, in order to things to be dug out, they're never gonna get dug out. But I'm down there. I don't understand why does that happen? And more importantly, why can I see that square? So what we have done is the orange line here. We have done only a down stair. It has gone from the interactableness, the layer of this Z layer, and it has reached down and it has pierced that camera space. Because it's pierced the camera space, we can kind of see what's below it. Because remember, camera space isn't a physical object. It's just a graphical object. So that is why we can see what is below it, because we can now see the top of the three squares, of the three height squares for the next Z layer down. In order to get down there, we have to do an upstair. Upstair, once that's dug, now we can get through. What is the upstair doing? The upstair is the same thing, the Z layer down below. It has gone from that Z layer, so it's interactable, and it has gone up and pierced the camera space of the Z layer, the camera space that's between it and the Z layer above it. That's really it is. And an up-down staircase is both a downstair and an upstair, so it is piercing both camera layers. When you do a ramp, ramps are slightly different. When you do a channel, that gives you a ramp. But you can go from a ramp, dig two over, and then you have an option to do an up ramp. So you order these differently, but notice how he did that from above. A channel and an up ramp are the same command. It's just how is he allowed to interact with it? And what that is all a ramp is. A ramp, which should have been drawn before this. A ramp is removing that camera space, that non-existent object between Z layers, and creating a diagonal slope in the Z layer below it. When you order it on your current Z layer, you're saying, I want the ramp to be here. When you were doing channel, you were saying, I want the ramp to be one down. But at the end of the day, they both do the exact same thing. They create a ramp, and they get rid of the camera space that blocks you from getting between Z layers of right above the ramp. Ramps need walls, because otherwise, how are you going to get from the top of this square to how are you going to get from the top, stop doing that, how are you going to get from the top elevation square to the Z level above it? You need something for them to reach. If you end up, sometimes you end up with ramps that don't have connected heights. If you do a ramp without there being an associated wall, then what you've done is, even if there's a hole there, you just have a ramp with no way to reach anything. Like, they can stand on top of it all they want, but they can't physically reach anything. This is why you need a wall next to it. For how things are supported and when you build everything, when you do a workshop, there are light squares and there are light green squares and there are dark green squares. Light green squares, like floors, are a construction, but you can walk over them. So they only take up the bottom of the three squares we're using for this example. The dark green square takes up the bottom two, but most importantly, does not take up all three. It is high enough to block travel, but because it is not reaching the bottom of the Z-level above it, it cannot support anything. You need a wall there to be able to support up above, which makes sense. But think about this. What that wall is, or when you build a wall, you can walk on it, and you can build a floor on a wall, but you cannot build a wall on a floor. A wall takes up 3 squares in its Z level. A floor takes up 1 square in its Z level. So if you build a floor, you're only taking up 1. If you build a wall, you're taking up 3. If I try to build a wall on a floor, I don't have, this was supposed to have been a square, I don't have 3 squares to build a wall, so it doesn't make sense. You have to get rid of the floor and then build a wall because now you have all 3 squares. However, if I'm at this Z level, I can just walk on the wall. I did a dirt road earlier, and we noticed that when we look at where the dirt road is, it says furrowed sandy loam. That's literally just the top of the naturally occurring loam wall below it. That's all walls are, constructed or natural. It's just a 3 height worth of terrain. So you can walk on it. That's why you can walk on a wall. It's doing the same thing as what regular terrain is. It's filled its 3 squares and you can walk on it. You just see the top of it because you are not in this camera, you are in this camera up here. So if you can walk on a wall and then you build a floor, all you're doing is you're building a 1 high on top of a wall. That's how you can build a floor on a wall. You cannot, however, build a wall on a floor because you can't have a wall in that camera space. The wall cannot go 3 squares across the Z-level camera space. Now, what is the purpose of all this? This is all physics we've kind of known in the back of our heads. Once, whenever we play the game, everything I've just said is really kind of information that even if you didn't know it, you knew it. You know you can build a floor on a wall, but you also know you can't build a wall on the floor. You might not have understood why. We're going to finish this with an explanation of what the 7 water levels actually are, or how they interact with dwarves. And this is so that we can bring a close to the water physics, and the physics that we introduced here is giving us a good starter to explain the physics of how minecarts work and why some of the physics in that can be abused to our advantage. Now, there are 7 levels of water. And certain levels have particular effects, and the wiki, at the very least, is very nice to explain to us what that depth is compared to a dwarf and how it affects a dwarf. The starting of this is a 1 Z-level water. Or not 1 Z-level, a 1 depth water. A 1 depth water has no flow, cannot go anywhere, and eventually at some point just kind of either evaporates or gets absorbed into the ground. It doesn't really do anything. It's just there graphically. It's not a thing to itself. If you have a 1 level of water, sometimes even your screw pumps have issues pumping them all the way up if you just have a 1 there. Not all the time. I don't know if that's just a slight bug on my end, but sometimes it seems like they have issues with it. If you have a 1 level, a lot of times it's 9. Sometimes it's interactable, sometimes it's not. Your dwarves can go through it. It doesn't necessarily clean them. What is 1? A 1 Z level of water, a 1 water depth, is actually, for all intents and purposes for our examples here in calculations, is a water that is existing in the lower Z levels camera space. It's there, you can see it, much like how you can see the wall of the Z level below, but you're kind of looking through a camera layer. Like when we go up, we can see through all the camera layers. A 1 depth of water is one that's kind of existing in the camera layer. It's there, but it doesn't calculate or do anything on its own. It's a thing we see. All right, we'll just have to take it as a theoretical existence that this 1 out of 7 water exists but doesn't exist. It exists in the camera space. Once you get to 2 water, though, we start having issues. This is finally interactable. By the wiki's definition, a 2 out of 7 water is knee height to a dwarf. However, if we try to bring this into our system, it's also half of one square. It's half of a square. It's very low. It's annoying. At some point, it will kind of maybe be able to go away. You can try to interact with it. It's there and it blocks you and it's annoying. Today's patch, today's update dropped into our fortress, so aquifers will be slower from this point. Just to point that out, yay. But even as slow as it is, you're gonna have an issue with that 2 out of 7 water, right? What is 2 out of 7 water? Well, it's only half of a square, but the problem is it's a square. It's there. It's like you round up for purposes of calculations. Because if I were to try to build on 2 out of 7 water and treat it as the bottom, even a floor would take up 2 squares. So now it's going to be off by a half. You can't do that. There's no such thing as being off by a half. So you always have to wait for the water to lower to 1 out of 7 so you can order and finally put in your floor or your wall. When you have a 2 out of 7, you're trying to do three squares, you're halfway through the thing above. You can't fit a wall in there. You've got too much water. The next thing up on water is 3 out of 7. Still slightly annoying. Good for cleaning your dwarves. And according to the wiki, it is at waist height. Hence why my weird armless dwarf looks the way he is. I did it to the heights it said. 4 out of 7 water is where your dwarf will not on his own try to pathfind through, but it is deep enough that he's going to have to kind of half swim through it. So basically at that point, it means he's buoyant. If nothing else, he has to be buoyant, which means the water has to be at or around lung height, upper chest, because otherwise you're just slogging through it. You're not swimming through water that's at like stomach region or lower, no matter how sturdy a dwarf you may be. So 4 out of 7 is we're starting to get into where a dwarf is, and he can't pathfind through it, but if he's in it, he can still swim around in it because he's floating. If we treat it at this point of, because he's able to kind of float in it a little bit, that he's not fully on the ground. And so at this point, this is where we're going into the weeds. This is a little bit of dwarfy fun like theory crafting. But if you're at 4 out of 7 and you're buoyant in it, he probably goes up a little bit into the next height and he loses a height here. So he still takes up a full 2. This is kind of half important for some math I'll throw back a little bit later to blow your minds. But this is where we're going to treat the water as 4. And then at 5 water, it says it's at the head. It says 5 water depth is head height for a dwarf, but he's not drowning yet. It doesn't declare if that means it's at his jaw or the top of his head. Because you swim at 4, and that's here, and how the water's going, I'm going to assume that that's at the top of the head. He's not drowning, but you can always turn your head up and like be on tippy toes to breathe. You know what I'm saying? So it's at his head, but it's not hard to just stay there. Like you're not treading water per se. You can kind of support yourself on the water, be slightly buoyant, and be breathing at the top of it. That's 5 out of 7. 6 out of 7 water, we start having issues. This is above dwarven head height. They are not drowning. They can swim around at this just by natural flotation, but at some point exhaustion will overtake them and they can die in 6 out of 7 water. So that is up here, and it's clearly a half a square above dwarven head height. It makes sense. At that point, you're treading water. No one can tread water indefinitely. And then what happens at 7? We have filled the entire Z layer. And this is kind of an important thing to point out for how water physics works and the Z layers work, because 6 out of 7 is above a dwarf, but it's kind of also just slightly annoying for everyone. But 7 out of 7 water in a particular Z level drowns you. It drowns you. It drowns a dragon. It drowns a freaking rock, a legendary bird with a 20-foot wingspan. Anything that needs to breathe drowns if they're in 7 out of 7 water and they can't go higher. So if you're in a cave where someone has a floor up here, so someone has floored you in. Remember, the camera space doesn't really exist. if someone's floored you in and the water is 7 out of 7, this is really touching that square. There's no air left. Everyone drowns at this regardless of their height. Later on, Toady has said he will work on the creatures so that they have multiple Z levels in height and or maybe not drown like this. But right now, every creature fits in one Z level and a 7 out of 7 is guaranteed to drown you regardless of how tall you are supposed to be. Now, this brings up a few interesting points that I would like to address. One, by the math we've done here, using the water system, we've kind of half proven slash wibbly wobbly on a bit of the physics that a dwarf is 2 squares high. If we treat 1 as being in the camera space and 5 as being at their head, everything kind of still makes sense. 7 drowns anybody. It's a full lockout on the Z level. 6 is a little bit below that. There's only so many ways to divide 7 into this system. A dwarf is about 2 squares high. We can take that as true. If we go back to our earlier math on when we build the workshops and how dark green was 2, if you have a light green for a floor or you have a light green for a workshop, the dwarf steps onto it. The dwarf is 2 squares high. He can fit in this. This is where a dwarf fits. It mathematically, it just works. Fallout 76 in this shit, it just works. But a dwarf cannot fit up here because a dwarf cannot exist in that camera space. He can transfer from one to the other using stairs that breach the camera space, but the dwarf cannot exist in that camera space. So the dwarf can't get on top of this. And in that Z level, there's only 1 square. So the dwarf can't go through it. So a dwarf is 2 squares high. The water physics half makes sense with our description. The ramp, the stairs, this is basically what a Z level is if you break it down. This is all there is to a Z level, is this weird 3 square system and an existing slash non-existing camera space. I am not going to go into it for this video, but this, as goofy as it was, is a firm foundation for understanding how some of the minecart physics can be broken, because out of everything in the game, a minecart is the thing that is most likely to go rapidly at rates that require physics between multiple Z levels. Hopefully, my art wasn't too bad to have distracted you from the learning, but if you found this video educational, give it a thumbs up and put in the chat below if there's any part of this that is baffling, or not say baffling, but if any part of this blew your mind, like somehow you knew this, but you didn't know you knew this. If you want to argue with me, if there's some part of the game that I didn't address with this 3 square calculation, put that down below too. Maybe I'll release a revised version of this video. If you find me entertaining, consider giving the channel a subscription. We're up to like 250 and we've been growing fast, guys, since I started uploading direct to YouTube. Thank you all so much for your support. Consider giving the channel your support if you haven't already. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.